Says, I need a new protest shirt. What would my friends recommend? Very good. Poo Poo Picker Upper says, took my neighbors to a peaceful protest here in Northwest Ohio. That's awesome. Congratulations. On that note, let's talk about OnTyranny. So that's the book I'm reading, OnTyranny by Timothy Snyder. I'm taking my dear old sweet time with it. I know I am. I'm reading a chapter a week. And this week I read it was chapter 13. And it's entitled Practice Corporeal Politics. And the author goes on to describe being out among people. Incredibly valuable. Being out among people, getting out and protesting. And he talks about the solidarity movement in Poland in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. I don't know if anybody else remembers, but I remember being a kid and we had a radio station where I grew up in Miramichi, New Brunswick, CFAN 790, I think it was on the AM. It was on the AM dial. And every morning, my alarm clock would go off right around the same time that the news was coming on. And Lech Walesa was always being mentioned every day. I seem to remember hearing that name, and his protests and his defiance, and the work he was doing with the unions in communist Poland. The author describes the need when it comes to standing up to tyranny. The author describes our need to not only to stand beside one another, but to make friends with one another, like getting together physically and making friends with each other. And I think it's a really brilliant point, right? Because a protest shouldn't just be 10,000 people coming together and then dissipating. There's power to that, but it's much more powerful if 10,000 people come together. And when it's time to break apart, when it's time to go home, that actually it's now 1,000 groups of 10 going home, going their own separate ways, that people come together, they get to know each other a little bit, they get to hear each other's stories a little bit, they get to connect in a way that makes them want to keep connected in the future, right? And so it's not 10,000 people who are all just going home like smoke sort of dissipating into a wind. Rather, it's 100 groups or 1,000 groups who have come together, these groups of people who've come together, got to know each other, and now they've decided they're going to remain in some sort of, they're going to remain together in some fashion through some medium as a community. And perhaps people are now find themselves connected to 2 or 3 or 4 different communities of people through that same protest. And so it builds these really important bonds. It builds these really important bonds that those connections are just so much more difficult to manipulate or to influence. Those connections are so much more difficult to destroy. You just think about a tight-knit fabric, right? I mean, think about Kevlar. Just as a concept, Kevlar is fabric. It's fabric that is woven in a particular way, and because it's woven in that particular way, and there's layers of it, that it actually absorbs kinetic energy. When I was in university, I really enjoyed taking classics, so ancient Greek history, and I remember we were studying the Peloponnesian War, which was a war that was fought between Athens and Sparta. And my professor, Professor Konishi, was a great guy. But Professor Konishi, he had such a love for Athens, and he I think he was a romantic at heart. But when he described Sparta, one of the reasons why he said Sparta was as powerful as they were, it wasn't just the whole warrior ethos, though that's a big deal, but it was also how these warriors related to each other when they were out in the field during the war season. So they were all supposed to have wives and children and families. Okay, they were supposed to have children. That was part of their responsibility. Sparta was a very draconian society. So you were trained from a young child as a warrior, and then at a certain age you got married, and you were supposed to have kids who the state would start training as a warrior. But while you were away warring against your neighboring cities or against the invading Persian hordes, whatever it happened to be, Konishi told us that there was, I don't want to say it was a rule because I don't want to lead you astray, but the bottom line was it was expected that each soldier in the army would take a lover of another soldier. The premise being that if I were standing beside you and you and I were lovers, this wasn't a committed relationship, but you and I were lovers. And while we were standing together in the shield wall, while we were standing together against our enemy, while we were standing together, while we were standing side by side during the battle, that it would be more likely that I would fight harder for you and you would fight harder for me if we had that type of relationship between us. If we had the bond that comes from the romantic relationship. The tighter people get, the stronger they are. The tighter people get, the tougher they are to break apart. And so the author in this chapter, that's what they're saying. Make friends. Make friends of the other protesters. It's not about finding people who are exactly like you and finding people who share the exact same ideological understandings. And it's not about finding people that you can mold into clones of yourself or finding people who will mold you into a clone of them. It's not what it's about. We're all going to have different opinions. We're all going to have different understandings. We're all going to have different ideological values and morals and all that kind of stuff. But we're all there at that protest for a general reason. And that's enough to build a relationship on. And if maybe there are differences between us, then rather than allowing those differences between us to push us apart, allow them to be the catalyst that leads to a tighter relationship. Again, not because I'll just abandon what I believe to adopt yours, but rather I want to hear what you think. I want to hear what you have to say. I want to hear what you value, and I want to be able to tell you the same thing. I want to be able to ask you questions, and I want you to be willing to ask me questions. Through our understanding of one another, the relationships grow. The relationships foster. We become friends. Through those friendships and through the increasing friendships throughout all those people who gather that day, we become a much more difficult force to stop. Now, I know some of you aren't able to go out into protests and some of you aren't able to go out physically, and that's okay. The world in I think this book was written in like 2017 or 2018. The world's a very different place than it was even 7-8 years ago. Make those connections from where you are. Make those connections from where you are. Maybe they are virtual relationships. Maybe they're people that you meet online. That's okay. That's good. Right? It's good because, again, what do friends do? Friends support one another. Friends are supported by one another. And we can do that through a phone call. We can do that through a letter. We can do that through an email. We can do that through Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook. Personal relationships with one another. It makes us much more difficult to break apart. If we're growing together, if we're intentionally and actively growing together. Amen.